So this is a topic which has been, I think, a long time coming. It's something that we've been needing to address here at Antioch. It's been something which I think that students have been kind of wanting to know, what is the wisdom of the church as we confront what is sometimes called modern gender ideology, or the phenomenon known as transgenderism. And that's actually going to be the focus of the talk tonight, is what is a Catholic take on that. And so I wanted to tell you that the structure of tonight's talk, we're going to talk about the phenomenon of transgenderism and the accompanying ideology. We're going to talk about it from two different sides, from sort of like the classical Christian side and maybe sort of like the secular progressive side that looks at it. And we're going to try to understand first both worldviews, and then we're going to critique, and then we're going to talk about how we apply that in our daily lives. And so there's going to be a lot of talk about ideas tonight, but I wanted to start off with a more personal side of it. This is, in 2018, the New York Times ran an editorial by a person named Andrea Long-Chu, and this person is one of the roughly 0.6% of those who identify as transgender. And in this column, Andrea described the experience of what's called gender dysphoria. Gender dysphoria is the experience of being in, say, a male body, and yet having the irresistible thought, the impulse that you are in the wrong sex body. And so Long-Chu described it in this way. He said, dysphoria feels like being unable to get warm, no matter how many layers you put on. It feels like hunger without appetite. It feels like getting on an airplane to fly home, only to realize mid-flight that this is it. You're going to spend the rest of your life on an airplane. And that description of the acute mental anguish that goes along with the experience of gender dysphoria or transgenderism, that really stuck with me. It really helped me better understand the sort of mental anguish that a person who identifies in such a way, what that person is going through. And I've tried to keep that in mind. Now, I was talking about this issue of gender ideology and transgenderism with a friend at work, and he asserted to me, as if I didn't know, he says, don't you realize that gender dysphoria is a real thing? This is a fact. This is a scientifically proven fact. And I agreed with him. I said, yes, this is a thing that everyone is aware of, that it exists. The difference between you and I isn't the data that we're looking at, it's the interpretation. You see, people can look at the exact same thing and completely perceive different things as they're looking at it. The middle example here is was the phenomenon known as the dress. If any of you guys remember that from a few years back, I mean, I tried to get the original image, and so if I got the original image and the monitors are displaying at the right aspect ratio, then, you know, I see the white and gold. Okay, so later on we can fight each other over that. Yeah. Now, underneath all of your chairs is a knife, which you can fight the person next to you. Now, when that came out, I was fascinated by it for probably longer than the normal person, because I was really fascinated by, you know, it's what you see is depending on the structure of your eye and how your brain is developed and what lights you've been seeing in your life, and it was like your brain is conditioned to interpret light in a certain way, and because of that, two people standing next to each other will see completely different images. And so my wife and I, we looked at it, and yeah, we see completely different images, just as a result of our conditioning growing up in our heritage. And then also to the left and to the right, those are two kind of famous double images. The one on the left, depending on how you look at it, is sort of an old Russian woman or sort of a bourgeoisie, you know, rich woman who's looking away from you. You're looking at the back left side of her jaw. And the thing on the right is either a rabbit looking upwards or a duck looking to the left.
Where's the rabbit?
So, yeah. So, maybe I should just make the rest of the presentation on these things. All right, let's bring it back. Bring it back. So all of this is meant to illustrate how two people how two people can look at the same thing and see two radically different objects, can have two radically different interpretations. And that, my friends, is what's going on when people look at the issue or the phenomenon of transgenderism. And one's interpretation of what Lang Shu is experiencing is dependent on your answer to the question, what is a human being? As you look at a human being and you ask the question, what is this? Your answer to the question of what Lang Shu is experiencing and what are you seeing when you're looking at this experience is going to depend on what you believe the human being is. And so tonight we're going to go over two different views, one which I call the operator view and the other one which I call the unitive view. Those are my terms, but these are real ideologies that are out there. And we're going to walk through these things and talk about where people are coming from when they're looking at what's going on with people who identify as transgender. So let's begin with the unitive view. Now, this is the view that comes to us from I think it's what you grow up understanding. It's sort of the common sense view that you sort of just derive naturally. It's reflected. It's also affirmed in the Bible, where Genesis chapter 1 says God made them in his own image. In the image God made them, male and female he created them. And this is also reflected upon in sort of the best of Greek philosophy, like Aristotle, where he talks about nature and how the human being is composed of matter and form. And what this is meant to say is that there is a human nature that we are all participating in. There is such a thing as human nature, and we are all expressions of human nature. We are human nature given to matter. So we're first humans, generally. There is a human nature, but then human nature has two expressions, which are, of course, man and woman, male and female. And that the matter brings, let's say, incarnation to those forms, to that nature of male and female and human. And from this point of view, it means that what you are, the answer to what are you, is tied up inextricably with matter, with what you are, with what you're seeing when a person looks at you, what the atoms compose. And so just like anything else, if you pointed at a four-legged creature with a waggly tail, I would say, well, that's a dog. You recognize what a thing is by what it looks like, by what the matter is. And so going along with that, from sort of the classical Christian and even, I think, common sense view, masculinity and femininity are bodily realities. Right? So what are you? What you look at is the body. Now the body relates to the mind. And there's a certain way in which we understand the relations of the body and the mind. And my favorite analogy that I like to use is the analogy of a triangle. With a triangle, you have the external, the sides, and you have the inner, which is invisible, which is the angles, but together they form one thing. And that is the relationship, on this view, between the mind and the body. One is interior and invisible, the other one is exterior and visible, but together they form one thing, which is the human person. And so the essence of what we are, again, is bound up in your body. St. John Paul II is often quoted as saying that the body is the sacrament of the person. A sacrament is a spiritual reality expressed through matter. And so what John Paul II reflected upon was that in the body you have a spiritual reality which is manifested materially. And that's why the Catechism in section 362 says, man, though made body and soul, is a unity. The unity of body and soul is so profound that in man there is not two natures united, but their union forms a single nature. And then the last very important thing to address is that despite having a nature and despite being created by God, we are fallen creatures. Also, shortly thereafter in the Catechism it says, in that sin, namely the sin of Adam, man preferred himself to God, and by that very act scorned him. He chose himself over and against God, and they became afraid of God. And what the church and what Christianity has always understood is that as a result of the initial fall of Adam and Eve, all human being lives out the negative consequences of the fall. And because of that, we're all suffering in various ways. And we come into the world with various problems, many which are general to all of us, and some which are acute to just you. So to recap, the unitive view is there's a real human nature which is expressed through male and female. There's a unity between the body and the soul that together the two of them form one thing. Masculinity and femininity are bodily realities, and you know what a thing is by looking at its matter. And we are fallen creatures, and so we're subject to all kinds of flaws and suffering. With that, let's go to the second view, which I've called the operator view. If you guys recognize this little creature, this is from the franchise Men in Black. There's a guy's head opens up, there's a little alien inside piloting the body. Now, again, this is my term for this ideology, and the thing is, you're not going to find people holding all of the following tenets in complete chemical purity. What really is more the case is that maybe the faculty at a college holds all of these things together consciously, but then they disseminate it to their students, or maybe it's like a director in Hollywood holds this explicitly and packs it into movies. And so you find people with bits and pieces of this ideology, enough to sort of lead them astray. And so maybe you'll recognize some of these things as we go. And so this ideology, originally you would have called it Gnosticism. If Christianity has any sort of arch rival which has been there from the beginning, sort of a Ganon to Link, or Lex Luthor to Superman, if there was any sort of inherent rivalry between Christianity and any other ideology, it would be this thing called Gnosticism. And in its most recent incarnation, it comes to us by the means of more modern philosophers like René Descartes, who was famous for proposing that human beings are not one nature, but are actually two natures, the mental nature and the bodily nature. So you suppose that we're two things that just kind of are glommed on together. There's a philosopher named Jean-Paul Sartre who rejected the idea that there is a human nature at all. More recent feminist theologian Simone de Beauvoir, who talked about how being man or woman is not necessarily something which is something you're born into, but is merely a pattern of behavior, which is something which is ingrained in us by society. And then all that gets kind of mixed into a blender of the sexual revolution, which tries to toss off classical Christian ideas of chastity, and then creates sort of this ideology. And so it starts with the assertion that there is no human nature. There is no pattern that we participate in. And what you're seeing here, this image is called the genderbread man, and this is a real thing that you can look up. This is a thing which is actually given to kids in the earliest days of school, and it's an attempt to define what a human being is. And if you see there, it's probably can't read it from here, but everything is on a slider, and it just treats everything as almost like a character creation kit from Elder Scrolls or something, if you play video games. And anyways, so yeah, it's a famous video game series. It's awesome. Anyways, so the assertion here is that there is no human nature. Everyone is totally unique. There is no humanity. There's just persons. Everyone is unique. Everything is on a spectrum. Nothing is normative. There is no higher plan for humanity. There's just individual persons. And you can tell a person holds this sort of ideology if they talk about a person being assigned a sex at birth. That word assigned, what it's meant to indicate is that this is an imposition from the outside. And so they'll say you were assigned the sex at birth, as if that's sort of an unjust thing that someone did to you, someone telling you what you are. So that's the first thing, is that there is no human nature. We're all just atomistic individuals that have really no ties to one another. All right, the second thing is a unique or newer understanding of the word gender. Gender is distinct from biological sex. When I was in high school, the word gender and sex were used completely interchangeably. No one thought anything of it. But as words do, they acquire new meanings. And anyway, so it's meant to describe your experience of where you fit in on the scheme of masculine or feminine or otherwise, even if you think that you don't fall on that scale whatsoever, if you're just a completely different concept. And your gender identity is the thing that determines if you are a man or a woman or something else entirely. And so your gender identity, rather than your body, is the thing that really determines what you are. All right, so the answer to the question, what is this, isn't answered by your body, it's answered by your gender identity. The next thing is that the mind is the person. So again, as Christians, we hold that the human person is a mind-body unity, and on this view, the mind simply is the person. Now this image is from this really jarring scene from the 2014 remake of RoboCop, and you wouldn't think that the RoboCop movie would have some really high philosophy going on in there, but if you know what you're looking for, you find it, because the doctor, played by, I think that's Gary Oldman, the thing that he kept on saying to RoboCop and to all of his other patients was that as they struggle with the loss of their bodies and limbs and stuff, he would point to their head and say, no, you are up there. Your body is just a tool that you're using, and you are still here. And so in this jarring scene where he starts off with the whole robot suit, and he says, take the robot suit away, and they pull away all the limbs until there's nothing left but this canister holding his lungs and his heart and then his head. And he has sort of a mental breakdown there in that scene, and Mr. Oldman says to him, no, you're still here, you are up here in your head, and your body is just a tool that you use to move around in. All right, so it's a very utilitarian idea of what the body is for and what it is. It's very different from understanding that the body really is part of you, and the body is you. You are your body, because your body and your mind, your soul are one thing. And then lastly, humanity is not fallen. I can't stress the importance of this one enough. That the idea that there is no wounded human nature, and however you're born, that's the way you're supposed to be. And in fact, it's your right and your duty almost to act out on what your natural inclinations are, and a person would be doing an injustice to you if that person encourages you to do otherwise. And you see this anytime a person says, how could name something be wrong? I was born this way. I mean, there's songs to that nature. And I remember one time I saw a YouTube video of a guy who interrupted a mass in the UK. He just stood up in the middle of mass, probably during the homily, and just started lecturing the crowd there about how the church is unjust because it teaches chastity, which includes a prohibition on same-sex sex. And he says, how could you possibly say this is wrong? Don't you realize I was born this way? And anytime a person says, I was born this way, and they mean for that to prove something to you, lodged in that complaint is the idea that humanity isn't fallen. Because if you have a robust understanding of human nature, you realize, well, you're born that way. I'm sorry, we're all born in broken ways. That's the doctrine of original sin. But if you don't have a doctrine of original sin, if you believe that humanity isn't fallen, then you have no concept of really being born with sort of desires and inclinations that are actually bad for you. And so the idea is that if you're born a certain way, then that's proof positive that that's how you're meant to be. And so to recap, the operator view is there's no human nature, only individuals, and there's no norms. And I once asked a person, like, as we are talking about whether or not there is a human nature that we participate in, whether or not there's actual norms, I brought up this really extreme case of this, I was watching like a radical reconstruction plastic surgery show on TLC a while ago, and there was this poor man who lived in like the hinterlands of China who was born with two mouths. I mean, like literally, he had a mouth sticking out the side of his head. And the surgery was mostly successful. He got him looking fairly normal at the end. But I asked the person, can we at least admit that human nature would have as a pattern that we have one mouth, that we are a one-mouth species? And the person just bit the bullet, went to Crazy Town and said, no, we have a mouth spectrum. There's a spectrum of mouths. So again, the operator view starts with the understanding that there's no human nature. We're all just individuals with traits and there is no participation in any sort of higher quality. The mind is the person. The body is just a vehicle. Your gender identity is the subjective experience, and that defines what you are, and we are not fallen creatures. So, how would each one of these two worldviews view Andrea Longtrue's experience? To put it kind of in sort of crass computer terms, is this a hardware problem or is this a software problem? From the operator point of view, what you would see is a woman who was unfortunately born into a male body. And then the most loving and compassionate thing you can do is to reshape that body to best match the person's inner reality. That's where that ideology leads you. The unitive view would be very different. That's, again, sort of the classical Christian view, and it would hold that this is a man who believes himself to be a woman and is struggling with a form of mental illness which you could compare to something like anorexia nervosa, which is sort of the unbidden, uncontrollable belief that you're larger and heavier than you are, and it leads to self-destructive behaviors, or another one called body integrity identity disorder, which is one where you believe wholeheartedly and just incorrigibly that parts of your body, like your limbs, shouldn't be there, and that again leads to self-destructive behaviors. And so, from that point of view, you would see Andrea Longtrue as a person who's suffering with a sort of mental illness of that sort. And the conflict between these two views and these two different interpretations shows up in all kinds of places that you're probably familiar with. Conflicts over restrooms and locker rooms. Who is to enter into the boys' or the girls' locker room? Who has the right to enter there? Medicine. Should doctors be compelled to perform sex change operations on people? And should doctors hold off on assigning a sex at birth because the person hasn't chosen their gender identity yet? And should a man insist on being able to see a female doctor because this person insists that he is a woman? In sports, another big area. I have a picture here from a biking championship. I can't remember which one this was, but there was a biological man who identifies as a woman who just crushed the competition, because I mean if you zoom over in the picture and you look at the thighs on those three people, it's almost comical the difference. It's like the person in the middle has like tree trunks for legs, and it's like the two women on either side are like, yay, you won, congratulations on setting all the world's records for women's sports. So it shows up in sports even with, like, I'm sorry ladies, but men have higher bone density, and we have a heart that works 20% more, 20% more blood. We have 20 times as much testosterone. We just, if you look at the world records for like the Olympics, it's like guys are generally 10% faster and better on every single track and field event, just because testosterone is a hell of a drug. So, and it's a wonderful thing. And that's why you have to kill all the spiders too. It's why you have to kill the spiders. It also shows up in language. Definitely it shows up in language. As people start insisting on having unique pronouns to them, like utterly unique pronouns never before used in human language, or just asking you to use the pronoun appropriate to their gender identity, or even using the word they to refer to a single indicative human being, which is, I mean, if you've grown up all your life seeing the word they only ever referring to a plural amount of persons, seeing the word they describing like a single person is just really jarring. And then it also sadly shows up in things like laws and business codes and school policies. So here's a couple headlines. In the UK, mother arrested in front of her children, locked in a cell for 7 hours after calling a transgender woman a man on Twitter. Virginia teacher fired after misgendering a student. This person referred to the person who identifies as a female as he, and got fired. In New York, there was a policy passed where if you are, I think it was a renter, and on the documentation that you give to your rentees, if you're a landlord and you give documentation to your rentees or your employees, and you intentionally and repeatedly use the wrong pronouns to that person, that would get you fined. And so it enters into all kinds of areas of life. So now let's ask the question, which of these views makes more sense? So the unitive view, as I've said all along, is what I think is the common sense view. The difference between boy and girl, man and woman, is literally among the first things you learn as a human being. It's reflected in every single language. Every single language has a word for boy and girl, and they know what they're talking about, like visually, when they use those words. And I think that this is a view that you really have to be educated out of. Now, that doesn't make it right automatically. I mean, I think that it's also very natural to believe that the world is flat. I mean, because you look around like, well, I don't see curvature, so I must be on a flat plane. So it doesn't make it right, but it is a good start. Probably the most formidable challenge to the unitive view is the presence of what's called intersex conditions. And over on the right side of it, there I have the Wikipedia page on intersex conditions, and it has there like how often that occurs. And you have to make sure that people realize this is different from transgenderism, because in the intersex condition, you have a body which is expressing both male and female aspects, particularly genitalia, or has confusing genetics. So you can actually point to an aspect of the body and say it is obscure to us whether we're looking at a man or a woman. And so this is kind of many times put forth as sort of like the killer argument against the unitive view, as if to prove that there is no such thing as male and female because these people have these conditions. But honestly, it's not something that people have been ignorant of. There's actually mention of this in the Bible by Jesus when he says that there are some who are eunuchs from birth. And so from a unitive point of view, all that we're really looking at, this is an unfortunate birth defect, but it is, again, part of having a fallen nature, that we have all kinds of things that go wrong, and sometimes in the area of our biological sex. And additionally, there's some really bad arguments that you hear, and this is one of them that I've gotten personally. A person will say, well, today we know that people don't always feel 100% masculine and 100% feminine, and people can feel like they have elements of both. I've had a person say that to me, and I'm like, no, people have always kind of known that you don't always feel 100% masculine or 100% feminine. It's like, that's kind of, people know that. We don't need to restructure our whole worldview based around the fact that I don't feel like I'm, some kind of macho man 100% of the time. The operator view has far more problems for it, far more things that make it completely incoherent. Let's start with the question about original sin and the fallen nature of humanity. Why assume that the way you're born and the inclinations you have are right for you, for sexuality or for gender, when we don't think the same thing about other conditions? So for instance, we're more than comfortable saying that emotional problems, suicidal ideation, eating disorder, alcoholism, all things that you can have predispositions to from your genetics or from the accidents of birth. We're more than happy saying that these are burdens that people have to overcome, these are things people have to live with, and these are harmful for a human being to act upon. We're comfortable saying it in those instances. But if you're really going to be consistent in saying that the way that you're born is the way you're meant to be, then you would have to really bite the bullet and say that all of these things are actually things that you're supposed to act out upon. But of course we don't. Another issue would be, if you can claim that your body doesn't match your inner reality in regard to biological sex, why can't the same be said for other bodily characteristics? And so here are a few examples of that. One headline, woman says she is cat trapped in the wrong body. So she went straight whole hog for species. Don't laugh. Seriously, don't. Canadian man leaves family to becomes transgender 6-year-old girl. Right? Age. Transabled, the idea that you're meant to, this is the body integrity disorder. The idea that you're meant to be disabled, and so people will do harmful things to themselves to try to make that the case. And then famously a person posed as a person of African descent for years and years and years because inwardly she identified as a different ethnicity. And so you ask the question, well, if you can say that your biological sex doesn't match your inner reality, why not these other things? And while the answer is always, well, that's totally different. But the explanation kind of stops there because, like, if you ask, well, why is it totally different? The explanation doesn't go much further than that because it's really hard to explain why these wouldn't be on the table if biological sex is. All right, the next kind of incoherence is just the question, how many genders are there? So Facebook famously for a while offered 70 different genders. I think now they just let you write in your gender. But the thing is, if your gender is just your inward feeling about how you identify yourself on the scale of male to female or masculine to feminine, then there's not 70 genders, there's not 400 genders, there's 7.5 billion genders because everyone's unique. Everyone adapts masculinity and femininity in their own unique ways. And so there's as many genders as there are heads. If you really want to carry through on the idea that gender is just, and again, I don't like to argue with people about what the word gender is. You'll see people try to really argue the point that there's only two genders. Guys, don't do that. I mean, at that point, you're just arguing about linguistics and the definitions of words. You're not arguing about anything of substance at that point. If a person insists to me that gender is the way you personally identify as male or female or masculine or feminine, I'm just like, fine, we'll grant that. But that's a rather individualistic thing. If that's the case, there's 7.5 billion genders, which invites the question of, if a person says, I want to go to the bathroom with people of my same gender, what does that even mean if there's 7.5 billion genders? Wouldn't we all just need individual bathrooms at that point? Isn't it kind of unworkable to say that people should be able to share the bathroom with people of their gender? And then the biggest incoherence of the thing is revealed when you ask the simple question, if a man can have a female body, what is a man? Define the word man for me, or define the word woman for me. What is a man? What is a woman? And this is a question I asked to my friend at work, who is definitely on the other side of this thing, and after a little bit of going back and forth, he realized that he couldn't answer the question, what is a woman? He had no way to answer that question. Because if you can't use biology in your definition, which again, for us, rather, it's very easy. What is a woman? Adult human female. Now, what is a man? Adult human male. Or your physiological definition. But if you're going to say that you can be a man with a perfectly healthy female body, okay, then you've just ruled out biology from your definition. So what's left? Are you going to say it's a temperament? Are you going to say that a woman is someone who's empathetic? Okay, well, what if you have a woman who just isn't very empathetic? What if you have a man who is empathetic? I mean, if a very empathetic person comes up to you and says, I'm a man, I'm just happen to be very empathetic, are you going to say, no, you're wrong, because women are empathetic? Or is it interest? Are you going to say that girls are the ones who are interested in fashion and the color pink? Like, what if a woman isn't interested in the color pink? What if she's interested in trucks? What if she's interested in target shooting with large guns? You know, what if are people not allowed to violate these stereotypes? What about clothing preference or aptitudes? All that you're left to fall back on in defining man and woman are just stereotypes. And when a person realizes that they realize that the term man and woman becomes completely meaningless, and all they're really doing is taking the biological understanding of man and woman and sort of the ideas of masculinity and femininity that flow from that, and they're just reaching in and stealing it for a second to use it in their ideology. But of their own, they can't define the words man and woman. Now, I wanted to put in here a case study of which view makes more sense when you're looking at it in the sort of on-the-ground reality. So multiple studies have shown that among children who experience gender dysphoria, children who would be called transgender in their youth, 80% stop having that experience by the end of puberty. Okay? Multiple studies have shown this. So what are we to make of that of that data? Well, if you're taking the operator view, what you would have to say is that during their youth, let's say you have a little kid with a male body who identifies as a little girl, and then that experience goes away during puberty when the magic of testosterone hits and facial hair happens. what happened? Well, you'd have to assert that originally there was a girl in that head, and then with puberty happening, now there's a boy in that head. So where did the girl go? Is that person like annihilated? Where did this new person come from? It's a very bizarre framework that you have to interpret this with if you're going to hold that what you are is your gender identity, and it goes from girl to boy during puberty, and you're like, what happened? Where's the girl? Did she die? Is the boy now only like a year old? It doesn't really make sense. The more normal way of looking at this is just you're looking at, from the unit point of view, they were boys all along. They just had a neurological or psychological issue which resolved itself in 80% of cases with normal hormones and socialization. So I think that the classical Christian way of looking at things just makes a hell of a lot more sense. But how do you do that? How do you talk about that just in the hallways of high school or later on college? Well, here's some piece of advice that some of it is, biblical truth, some of this is going to be my opinion. I'll let you know which is which. So the first thing is to remember that a person who identifies as transgender is a person who is struggling and dealing with immense psychological distress. You remember how Andrea Lungshu described it at the beginning. Intense emotional pain and discomfort. And don't forget that you're dealing with a person who is suffering in a way that you can't understand. And when a person is suffering, the thing you have to do with a person who's suffering is listen. Right? You have to be willing to listen. There's few things more dehumanizing than having a person preaching at you what you are without being willing to at least hear you out and to listen to you and to hear your story and to know where you're at. So definitely be sure to listen first. And never, ever mock or tease, not even among other people, not even when they're not around. Don't allow yourself that opportunity. And that includes things like, even at ACTS, I'll hear people sort of mock this point of view and say, I identify as an attack helicopter. People will kind of ridicule the view in saying that. Don't do that. It's not helpful. It doesn't help anybody. Right? To mock this person's self-identification is not going to help this person heal. And so resist all attempts to mock or strawman this point of view. Now, when it comes to names, a lot of people will change their name as they're going through this experience. They'll insist to be called by something else. Now, your name is tied up with your identity, and there's a name for calling a person by their former, how many times can I use the word name in one sentence? When you call a person by their given name, and they don't want that name anymore because they are identifying as transgender, they call that dead naming, if anyone's ever heard that term before. They're saying that old name is dead to me, don't call me by that, and you'll get very severe reactions from a person if you insist on calling them by that original name. So, at least from my point of view, we use names other than our given name all the time. If I met a guy at work and he says, my name is Brian, but my friends call me Mac, I'd be like, hi Mac, right? I wouldn't think a thing of it. And so from my point of view, there's nothing really wrong with acquiescing on the name. If I was dealing with a little kid, I might feel differently because a kid is much more malleable in their identity, and I don't want to reinforce that identity for a kid because you don't know if they're, if you just reinforce their original identity, if that will come back. But if I'm dealing with an adult or a person at high school level, I would be far more willing to honor their insistence that you use this name. The next thing is that even though you approach a person who is clearly one sex and yet believes that he or she is the other sex, that might be the first thing that comes to your mind, but of course it's not the first thing you want to bring up. Right? You want to respect people's privacy. People just like to be treated normal, and they want to be treated like they're not, a science experiment, and so you don't have to bring this thing up if you're talking to a person. I love the advice given by Catholic apologist Jimmy Akin on Catholic Answers Live. He was asked by a caller, what do I say to this person who I interact with who is transgender? What should I say to this person? And he says, well, you don't have to talk about that. Go for more basic questions like, what's your relationship with God? Can you get them? Can you talk to a person on a more basic level first before you talk about these other issues? Can you talk about the most important things first? And I really took that to heart as first things first. And Pope Francis had a similar observation at the beginning of his papacy, how he said, you don't want to lead with the rules. Lead with who is God and what's your relationship to that person. Persons for God, because there's 3 persons of the Trinity. But there are limits. And here I use the example of St. Thomas More, who after King Henry VIII broke off from the Catholic Church, he wanted to insist that basically King Henry wanted to insist that he was basically the Pope of England. And he wanted all of his magistrates, all of his bishops, to renounce the Pope as the earthly head of the church. And St. Thomas More famously tried to accommodate King Henry VIII as far as he could possibly go until he was absolutely forced with the yes or no decision, do you renounce the Pope? And he had to say no. Right? There came a point where Thomas More tried to accommodate in every way that he could until his conscience wouldn't let him go any further. And so these are the areas that I think that I, at least personally, can't go in good conscience. At least the way the English language is structured. We assert things when we're using pronouns. So if I went up to a dog and I said, does he bite? Right? Well, I've just assumed that this is a boy dog, and the person might say, well, she doesn't bite. Right? In which case they're asserting back to me, this is a girl dog. The way that we use pronouns in English, it is to assert something of fact. And so if someone says to me, someone with a perfectly fine operating male body insists that I use a female pronoun for that person, I couldn't bring myself to do that because I feel like I would be being dishonest with my language. So that's an area that I can't go. And yes, the term for that is misgendering. And so that's something that I would feel that I would have to do. Or I could try to avoid using pronouns altogether if I could. I couldn't support a person in sex change surgery. Now, sometimes people will argue, well, it's the people who identify as transgender have massively higher suicide rates than their normal population, something like 12 to 20 times higher. Some people will say that studies have shown that a successful sex change operation will help the person decrease the amount of suicide. Maybe that's true. I mean, people get into dueling study wars. They'll throw studies at each other and links as if they're experts. I try to avoid those. It might be true that a sex change operation might decrease the amount of suicidal ideation a person experiences. But at the same time, I don't have to insist that that's right or healthy to do. In the same way that a person might insist to me that bulimia is an effective way of losing weight. It is, but it's not the best thing for the person to do. It's not what's right, and I could never recommend bulimia to a person. In the same way, I could never recommend a sex change operation to a person because that is the mutilation of a body. You're taking the body that God gave you, which works perfectly fine, and you're chopping perfectly functional things off of it, which are meant to be there. And your body is going to perceive that as a wound for the rest of your life, and you're never going to be medically normal for the rest of your life. So I could never condone that. And then on just a practical level, allowing a man to use a biological male to use the female sports team is just, you saw what that results in, and it's just unfair. It's like the death knell of women's sports. And then the opposite sex locker rooms is, again, just like a no-go for me. I wouldn't want my boys to have to deal with that, and if I had a daughter, I wouldn't want her to have to deal with that. And so that's sort of like the areas where I think I have to Thomas More this thing and say, no, past there I can't go. Okay, so we're gonna start closing down here. So if I was asked by a person, well, what is it that the Catholic expects of me? If I was confronted by a person, say at work or just anywhere, and the person who is transgender says to me, well, what does the Catholic Church expect of me? What's the goal here? And I would want to say, I thought about this for a while, and I'd want to say something like this. I'd want to say, you have a healthy body. And I don't know how you get there. I really don't. I don't know what the path is. But a Catholic would desire for you to somehow make peace with your body and to maybe somehow feel at home in your body. I don't know what the pathway is there, but that is what we would ultimately want. or some semblance of peace, something that you can live with. And that might mean a lifetime of struggling. As many people who have, mental health issues do have a lifetime of struggling ahead of them. I don't want to minimize your struggling, right? But we as a church are there for you with understanding and with grace. That is what I think is the Catholic vision of what we would hope for people. Because every single person who identifies as transgender, along with every other person in the world, is someone for whom Christ died. This is a person who has been afforded that dignity by God our Father, who has given us His Son, right? And so, people who identify as this, they might feel very alienated from a Christian church which sees them as bizarre, that doesn't accept them, that treats them with suspicion. And I think that we as a Catholic community have to be prepared to welcome everybody, even as we might call them to, in their discipleship, to go to try to make peace with their bodies. We have to accept people where they are and to go out and seek everybody. And as Christ said, the Son of Man has come to seek and save the lost. So that's what I got to speak tonight. Thank you.